All right, get into the vertebral column. So vertebra is singular, vertebrae plural. I'll probably mess that up though and use them interchangeably at times. We have 5 different types of vertebrae in our backbone in our vertebral column. This generally is 33 to 34 segments of vertebrae, although it can vary a little bit. You might have some people with 32. But we have 5 primary categories of vertebrae. Starting from superior to inferior, you have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, or your coccyx, your tailbone. So I would suggest learning them like that: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccyx, and then learning the numbers that go along with it: 7, 12, 5, 5, 5. All right. 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 4 to 5 sacral, but it's easiest just to remember 5. And it varies, but 5 coccygeal vertebrae. And if you look at the vertebral column here, you can see that the superiormost vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae, look much more narrow, much more small. And then as you go down the vertebral column, things get bigger and chunkier. And that is because the only weight that the cervical vertebrae has to support is the weight of the head. So they can afford to be smaller and more delicate. You go down to, say, your lumbar, those vertebrae are supporting the weight of everything from there up. The weight of the thorax, the weight of the head, and also the weight of anything that you lift. So the categories of vertebrae, if you look at cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, they all look different. They have slightly different features, but they share some very basic features. Let's look at some of the most basic features that all the vertebrae share. So first of all, looking at this vertebrae, this is the spinous process. So this, if you reach back and feel your backbone, feel your vertebral column, that is what you're feeling. So when you see this point on a vertebrae, that is posterior. That is always posterior. That means that this is anterior. What you're looking at here is the body of the vertebra, or the corpus. If we scroll back up, you can see the corpus, the corpi of all the vertebrae right here. So this is anterior, and then posterior, pointing posteriorly, you have the spinous processes. Projecting laterally from the corpus, you have the transverse processes. So all the vertebrae, they're going to look different, but all the vertebrae are going to have bone coming laterally off of the corpus to form a projection. Those are known as the transverse processes. And the transverse processes are going to come together and join posteriorly for the spinous process. In the middle, there's going to be a circle. That is the vertebral foramen, also known as the neural tube cavity. This is, if we followed that cavity, you would see through all of these vertebrae, you would see your spinal cord. This is where the spinal cord would be coursing vertically through the vertebral column. It courses through the vertebral foramen. Foramen is singular, foramina is plural. So here's another illustration. Here's the corpus, and by the way, this is a cervical vertebrae, but this is the corpus. Projecting laterally, you have the transverse processes, posteriorly, the spinous process, and the vertebral foramen in the middle. And here we have a lateral view of this same vertebra. So here's the corpus here. And then in this view, the spinous process is pointing out sort of the side. Here are some other details. We're going to get into what those are as we move along. I mentioned that those images we were looking at, that was a cervical vertebrae. I knew that was a cervical vertebrae because these holes right here, also known as the transverse foramen. So the word foramen means hole. So transverse foramen holds holes on the side, right? Transverse foramen within the transverse process. The cervical vertebrae have transverse foramen. No other category of vertebrae has transverse foramen. And if we look at it, the reason the cervical vertebrae have transverse foramen is because there are major arteries that branch off of the aorta and course up through the transverse foramen on the way to your brain. So the vertebral arteries, right and left, running from the aorta to your brain to give blood supply to your brain, run through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae. And no other vertebrae has transverse foramen. This is getting to be an old slide. You guys aren't going to know who Sarah Burke was. But when I was teaching up north, it was a big deal. Sarah Burke was this super pipe freestyle skier. So she was totally awesome. She was a media darling, as they say. And she was practicing for the X Games. Went up the side of the half pipe, came down. She had her helmet on. Her head hit the lip of the half pipe, and it didn't damage her brain, but it wrenched her neck so hard that it ripped open one of the vertebral arteries in her neck. And she died shortly thereafter. So the reason, when we're looking at the vertebrae, the reason you have the spinous and the transverse processes is that those processes provide surface area for muscles to attach to. And that's why the cervical vertebrae have very small spinous and transverse processes, because they're very small muscles that attach up here in your neck. If you go down, if you look at the lumbar vertebrae, these guys have, by comparison, big dinosaur-like transverse and spinous processes. That is because down here in the thorax and the abdomen, you have big muscles of the back that are slung from these large transverse and spinous processes. The spinous and transverse processes, they have to be big, bigger, and bony because they're being pulled on much more strongly by much larger muscles. So we've covered the vertebral foramen, which is the hole in the middle of the vertebrae through which the spinal cord passes. We've covered the transverse foramina in the cervical vertebrae, through which the vertebral artery passes. Now, there's another type of foramen we're going to talk about. When you stack the vertebrae on top of each other, it is going to form these little gaps between them. So you see these little holes right there, there, and there. These holes are known as the intervertebral foramina. Foramina is plural, intervertebral foramen, that is singular. Scrolling back up, you can see the intervertebral foramina. And so the intervertebral foramina provides spaces through which nerves course between your body and the spinal cord. And as the vertebrae come together, you can see that they touch here. So if we drop this vertebrae on top of this vertebrae, then that vertebrae is going to be touching that vertebrae right there. And so these points of articulation, the points of contact between the vertebrae, are known as the articular facets. If we looked at the articular facets on this vertebrae, the articular facets on the top of the vertebrae would be known as the superior articular facets. But those superior articular facets have to contact the articular facets of the vertebrae above it. So those facets on the vertebrae that articulate with the articular facets of the vertebrae below it are known as the inferior articular facets. So looking here, you can see that the superior articular facet on the top of this vertebrae articulates with the inferior articular facet on this vertebrae.